In the autumn of 1942, a Japanese soldier named Kazuo Sakamaki sat down in a wooden barracks at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin and wrote a letter home to his family in Okayama Prefecture. He was the first Japanese prisoner of war taken by the United States in the Second World War, captured after his midget submarine became stranded during the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had expected to be executed. Every principle of Bushido, every piece of training he had received in the Imperial Navy, every story he had been told about American brutality toward Japanese prisoners told him that capture meant death or worse. Instead, he was sitting in a heated barracks in the American Midwest, writing a letter on paper provided by his captors, describing food he had not eaten since before the war and treatment he could not reconcile with anything he had been taught about the Americans. His family in Japan never received the letter. Japanese censors intercepted it, read it, and decided that what it contained was too dangerous to deliver. What Sakamaki described in that letter, and what thousands of Japanese prisoners described in tens of thousands of letters over the following 3 years, was an America that did not match the country they had been taught to fear, hate, and die fighting against. The Imperial Japanese government understood with complete clarity that if those letters reached their destinations, the war would become much harder to fight. This is no man's land. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. New documentaries drop every single week. The picture of American captivity that the Imperial Japanese military had constructed for its soldiers by 1941 was designed with a specific purpose. It was designed to make surrender unthinkable. The Japanese military code, the Senjin-kun, issued by War Minister Tojo Hideki in January of 1941, stated explicitly that a soldier must not endure the shame of being taken prisoner alive. Death was preferable to capture. This was not merely a strategic preference or a tactical guideline. It was a moral absolute, enforced by the belief that a soldier who surrendered had forfeited his right to be considered Japanese, had brought irreversible shame upon his family, and had betrayed the emperor in the most fundamental way possible. To reinforce this absolute, the military propaganda apparatus filled the space where actual knowledge of American captivity should have been with stories. American soldiers tortured Japanese prisoners. American prison camps were places of systematic humiliation and deliberate cruelty designed to break the Japanese spirit before death. These stories were not entirely invented. The Pacific War produced documented atrocities on both sides, but the picture constructed for the ordinary Japanese soldier was not a nuanced account of wartime behavior. It was a portrait designed to produce a single psychological outcome. The Japanese soldier who believed what he had been told had no rational option except to fight to the death. Surrender meant something worse than death. Death in battle meant honor, meant the Yasukuni Shrine, meant a family that could hold its head up in the village. The propaganda worked. At Tarawa, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, Japanese forces fought until they were physically destroyed rather than surrendering at the point where military resistance had become tactically meaningless. The men who wrote the letters home from American prison camps were the exceptions, captured unconscious or wounded, or in circumstances where suicide was physically impossible. What they described when they picked up the pen shattered the picture that had been built to keep them fighting. The picture of American captivity that the Imperial Japanese military had constructed for its soldiers by 1941 was designed with a specific purpose. It was designed to make surrender unthinkable. The Japanese military code, the Senjin-kun issued by War Minister Tojo Hideki in January of 1941, stated explicitly that a soldier must not endure the shame of being taken prisoner alive. Death was preferable to capture. This was not merely a strategic preference or a tactical guideline. It was a moral absolute, enforced by the belief that a soldier who surrendered had forfeited his right to be considered Japanese, had brought irreversible shame upon his family, and had betrayed the emperor in the most fundamental way possible. To reinforce this absolute, the military propaganda apparatus filled the space where actual knowledge of American captivity should have been with stories. American soldiers tortured Japanese prisoners. American prison camps were places of systematic humiliation and deliberate cruelty designed to break the Japanese spirit before death. These stories were not entirely invented. The Pacific War produced documented atrocities on both sides. But the picture constructed for the ordinary Japanese soldier was not a nuanced account of wartime behavior. It was a portrait designed to produce a single psychological outcome. The Japanese soldier who believed what he had been told had no rational option except to fight to the death. Surrender meant something worse than death. Death in battle meant honor, meant the Yasukuni shrine, meant a family that could hold its head up in the village. The propaganda worked. At Tarawa, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, Japanese forces fought until they were physically destroyed, rather than surrendering at the point where military resistance had become tactically meaningless. The men who wrote the letters home from American prison camps were the exceptions, captured unconscious or wounded, or in circumstances where suicide was physically impossible. What they described when they picked up the pen shattered the picture that had been built to keep them fighting. The letters that Japanese prisoners wrote home in the first weeks of their captivity returned again and again to a single subject that might seem trivial compared to the larger questions of war and survival. They wrote about the food. They wrote about it with a specificity and emotional intensity that can only be understood in the context of what they had been eating before capture. The Japanese soldiers' ration in the Pacific War was a study in deliberate austerity. Rice was the foundation, augmented when supply lines permitted with pickled vegetables and small amounts of dried fish. As the war progressed and American submarines took an increasing toll on Japanese supply shipping, rations available to soldiers in forward areas became less and less adequate. By 1943 and 1944, Japanese soldiers on isolated Pacific islands were surviving on fractions of the caloric intake their bodies needed, and in the worst cases, facing genuine starvation as American naval and air superiority cut off resupply entirely. Against this background, the food served in American prisoner of war camps was experienced not as adequate, but as extraordinary. The prisoners wrote about meat served at multiple meals. They wrote about bread they had not eaten since before the war. They wrote about coffee and sugar. They wrote about quantities of food exceeding anything they had received during military service. They wrote about being fed different food when sick, chosen for medical appropriateness. A letter from a prisoner at Camp McCoy in 1943 described a Thanksgiving meal including turkey and pumpkin pie, dishes the writer had never encountered and had to describe phonetically because Japanese had no common words for them. His family, when they eventually read the letter after the war, said they had assumed it was fabricated. No one who had been a prisoner of war could have eaten like that, but he had. The Imperial Japanese government's censorship apparatus monitored all mail entering and leaving Japan throughout the war, and letters from Japanese prisoners of war in American camps were flagged from the beginning as material requiring special handling. The reasons were documented in internal government communications that survived the war. A Japanese family that received a letter from a son describing comfortable housing, adequate food, medical care, and respectful treatment in an American prison camp was a family whose son's willingness to fight to the death had been undermined by specific personal credible information from a source they trusted absolutely. The propaganda that had constructed the picture of American captivity as a fate worse than death could not survive contact with a letter that contradicted it in concrete detail. The government established specific protocols for intercepting and suppressing prisoner letters. Letters describing the material conditions of captivity in positive terms were confiscated. Letters mentioning specific camp locations or facilities were confiscated. Letters expressing anything other than appropriate shame at having been captured were confiscated. Some families received nothing from their captured relatives for the entire duration of the war. Others received letters that had been selectively edited, passages describing comfortable treatment removed, and only expressions of shame and duty retained. The government's fear was well-founded. In the few cases where letters reached their destinations through failures in the censorship system, the reactions in receiving communities were documented and reported to censorship officials as evidence of the destabilizing effect they had predicted. A mother in Osaka who received a letter describing her son eating turkey at a holiday celebration in Wisconsin did not keep that information to herself. She told her neighbors. Her neighbors told their neighbors. The information traveled with the speed and specificity that only personal testimony can produce, directly contradicting everything the government had been telling its population about the nature of the war. The American military's approach to Japanese prisoners of war was not purely humanitarian. It was also strategic, and the strategy was sophisticated. American military intelligence recognized from the earliest months of the war that Japanese prisoners were extraordinarily valuable sources of information, not because Japanese soldiers were poorly trained in resistance to interrogation, but because the combination of their culture's attitude toward captivity and the systematic destruction of their expectations about American treatment created psychological conditions that professional interrogators could exploit far more effectively than coercion would have allowed. American Nisei soldiers and civilians, Japanese Americans who spoke the language and understood the culture, were integral to the interrogation program and to the management of the camps. They served as interpreters, as cultural liaisons, and as individuals whose very existence challenged the racial ideology Japanese military propaganda had used to construct the image of the enemy. A Japanese prisoner who had been told that Americans were fundamentally contemptuous of Asians and who encountered Nisei soldiers who were American in every institutional and cultural sense while being Japanese in heritage was a prisoner whose entire framework for understanding the war was being challenged simultaneously from multiple directions. The Nisei interpreters described in their post-war accounts the specific moment repeated hundreds of times across dozens of camps, when a Japanese prisoner looked at them, understood what they were, and began to reconstruct his picture of what America was and what the war meant. That reconstruction was, from the American intelligence perspective, exactly the outcome they were trying to produce. A prisoner who had revised his understanding of America was a prisoner who might provide information, might cooperate, and in some cases might participate in psychological operations directed at Japanese forces still in the field. The Japanese government's censorship of prisoner letters was thorough enough that most families learned nothing accurate about their captured relatives' conditions until after Japan's surrender in August of 1945. What followed in the months and years after the surrender was, in many families, a process of double revelation. The families learned simultaneously that their relatives had survived, and that the story of American captivity they had been told was false. Both pieces of information arrived together, and the combination produced reactions documented by American occupation authorities and Japanese journalists that ranged across the full spectrum of human response to finding out that something fundamental you believed was wrong. Some families were simply relieved. Their son or husband or brother was alive when they had believed him dead, and the conditions of his survival were irrelevant to the overriding fact of his being alive. Other families experienced a more complicated reaction that post-war accounts describe as retroactive anger, directed not at the Americans who had held their relative prisoner, but at the Japanese government that had told them to expect something different. A mother who had spent 3 years believing her son was being tortured in an American camp, and then learned he had been eating turkey in Wisconsin in November of 1942, had been told a lie for 3 years. The recognition of that lie was itself a form of loss. The prisoners themselves, returning to Japan, faced a different version of the same problem. They were men who had survived captivity in a culture that had defined captivity as a form of death, returning to a country in the process of dismantling, under American occupation, the entire institutional apparatus that had defined them as dishonorable for surviving. Many did not speak publicly about their experience for decades. The letters that Japanese prisoners mailed home from American prison camps and that the Japanese government feared and suppressed were, taken in aggregate, a description of something the government understood and that the prisoners themselves may not have fully articulated, but that their families would have understood immediately if the letters had arrived as written. The letters were describing a country that could not be defeated by the methods Japan was using to fight the war. The food, the housing, the medical care, the treatment, the farms visible through the fence, the roads, the machinery, the Nisei soldiers who were simultaneously Japanese and American, all of it added up to a picture of an adversary whose material foundation was so far beyond Japan's capacity to match that the spiritual superiority doctrine was not a military strategy. It was a prayer. The prisoners who wrote those letters were not strategic analysts. They were soldiers and sailors and airmen who had expected to die and had instead found themselves alive in a country that was, by the evidence of their own senses, winning the war not through spiritual superiority, but through a form of organizational and material capacity that spiritual superiority had no answer for. The government knew that this picture, delivered through the trusted channel of personal correspondence from a known person to a known family, was more dangerous than any intelligence operation the Americans could have run against Japanese civilian morale. An official American propaganda broadcast could be dismissed as enemy lies. A letter from a son could not. The censors understood this and acted on it, and in acting on it, they protected the war for another 3 years. The letters arrived eventually, after the war, when they could no longer change what had happened, but could only explain it. They explained it perfectly. What the prisoners found in America was not what they had been promised. It was the truth of what they were fighting. And the truth was that Japan had decided to fight a total war against an adversary whose capacity was so much greater than its own that the outcome was settled before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The men who wrote the letters knew this. The men who stopped the letters knew it too. Japanese prisoners of war wrote letters home describing food, comfort, and treatment that their families could not believe. The government that intercepted those letters could believe them perfectly well, which is exactly why it stopped them. What the letters contained was not propaganda. It was the honest observation of ordinary men who had expected one thing and found another, and whose description of what they found was so dangerous to the story being told at home that it had to be suppressed for 3 years. When the letters finally arrived, after the war, after the surrender, after the occupation had begun, the families who read them understood something the government had spent 3 years trying to prevent them from understanding. The enemy was not what they had been told. If this video meant something to you, hit the like button right now. It is the single best way to push this story to someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you are not already here. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and whether anyone in your family served in the Pacific. We will see you in the next one.